welcome, and today welcome to the Frontline Dispatch Seminar hosted by the Computational Health Informatics program. Today we're very pleased to present Aaron Kesselheim from the Harvard Medical School, Brigham and Women's Hospital, Mass General Brigham, talking about accelerated drug approval and Aducanumab. The Dispatch series is something that we've started recently. It allows us to introduce current hot topics. We'll be presenting the talk, and then, but even as the talk goes on, you're welcome to put questions in the Q&A box. Some folks choose to put them in the chat box, and we'll look there too, but Q&A box is preferred. The Informatics program, I'll say a thing or two about it, was founded in 1994. It's a multidisciplinary applied research and education program at Boston Children's Hospital. And again, Frontline Dispatch series is our newest series. It's open to the public, and it's one of several event series that we run. You can learn more at chip.org/events. If you want to tweet about it, feel free to. These are some of the Twitter handles you might use. And again, Q&A box for your questions. I will say one or two words about Dr. Kesselheim. He's a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and a faculty member in the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology and Pharmacoeconomics in the Department of Medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital. And today's talk comes from his perspective as a former member of the FDA's Peripheral and Central Nervous System Drugs Advisory Committee, which after the approval of an Alzheimer's drug led to actually the resignation of several members of that committee. And so with that perspective, looking both backwards and forwards, Dr. Kesselheim will talk to us about the approval process, how it's worked, and also provide suggestions for the future. And with that, I will turn this over to Dr. Kesselheim.
Well, thank you very much for the very nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be able to join you. And I am looking forward to this conversation about accelerated approval and the application of accelerated approval to Aducanumab. As just some quick disclosures, no one in our division, including myself, has any personal financial relationships with any pharmaceutical company. Most of the research that I get for my work is from various foundations and government sources. And as Dr. Mandel said, I'm a former member of the FDA Peripheral and Central Nervous System Advisory Committee that reviewed Aducanumab. Just a quick note on the research group that I run, which is called Portal, acronym maybe slightly better than CHIP, or maybe just as good as CHIP, but certainly Dr. Mandel and I were thinking similarly when we were coming up with acronyms for our group. Portal stands for the Program on Regulation, Therapeutics, and Law. And we're an interdisciplinary research group that focuses on studying the regulatory, legal, economic, and clinical components of the pharmaceutical market. And I just wanted to give a shout out at the beginning to the members of my group listed there in bold. I'm going to present some research we've done on accelerated approval, and a lot of this research has been led by some of these folks, and so I just wanted to give them a quick shout out at the beginning. So just to kind of, what I want to do is divide my initial comments, which should take about a half an hour, 40 minutes or so, into three different sections. The first, I just want to talk more broadly about drug regulation and the goals of drug regulation, and then talk about accelerated approval and where the accelerated approval pathway fits into that paradigm, and into the sort of goals of drug regulation. And then in the last section of my comments, I want to talk more specifically about aducanumab and the application of aducanumab to accelerated approval, and then end with some final thoughts, and then open it up to questions, as I'm sure there'll be a lot of interesting things to talk about. So then just to start, for me, I think that there are three main goals of drug regulation. I mean, that explain why we have an FDA in the first place. And the first, is to protect consumers, because there's a long history, 100 years plus of history, hundreds of years of entrepreneurs that will try to sell people, particularly sick people, on cures, and that are worthless, or potentially dangerous. And this is a quote from the Supreme Court of a case relating to a cancer drug, in which they said that even individuals with fatal illness such as cancer should be shielded from fraudulent cures, because of this long history of these of all of these various types of products that have been sold as treatments for even a disease as terrible as cancer. So the goal of the FDA is to try to ensure that consumers are protected from these kinds of either worthless treatments or actually dangerous products. Another important purpose of drug regulation is to advance knowledge, and to require the conduct and dissemination of research clinical trials that will inform the use and effective use of medications, because if that didn't happen, the people who sold those products would be under incentivized to perform the research on their own. And you don't have to look back 100 years to know this is true. All you have to do is look at the nutritional supplement market in the United States, which was explicitly excluded from control by the Food and Drug Administration in the 1990s. And now there are, a lot of different nutritional supplements out there. A lot of them probably don't do anything. We don't know what a lot of them do. Some of them may be unsafe. There isn't a lot of data out on them. And that's because they're not subject to the same oversight that prescription drugs are. By contrast, prescription drugs, when they're approved, usually have data that help us figure out how to prescribe them. And then finally, the goal is another goal of regulation is to promote well-functioning markets, to provide a certification of drug quality. And if you're a pharmaceutical company that has a drug that you really believe in and that really does work, you want a strong FDA, because you want to prevent other companies that have drugs that don't work but may have better insights into marketing than you do from directing patients away from your product that might actually help them. So with that in mind, the FDA has been developed to try to meet those goals. And one of the ways it does that is by enforcing minimum regulatory standards for new drugs. So under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, in order for a drug to be approved by the FDA, it has to have substantial evidence of effectiveness that arise from adequate and well-controlled investigations. It has to meet certain minimum standards for safety, and the FDA will approve the drug if the benefits appear to outweigh the risks. You'll notice that there is no real, formal requirement for an adequate and well-controlled study for what kinds of study a drug needs to have in order to be approved. But the FDA has tried to define what an adequate and well-controlled study is. It includes a valid comparison between an experimental and a control group, methods that are intended to try to minimize bias and to try to assess clear responses of the research participants, and using controls such as placebo controls or dose comparison concurrent controls, even historical controls can be acceptable. But again, what you'll notice here is that a specific level of evidence is not required. A certain degree of effectiveness is not required. And neither are details about like how much people need to be in a trial, et cetera. So there's a lot of flexibility within this rubric. And then in addition to these trials that are done before approval, the FDA can request post-approval studies be done, as well as to do routine pharmacovigilance of approved studies of approved drugs to evaluate, continue to evaluate their safety and effectiveness once the drug's been approved. Since 2007, the FDA is allowed to fine companies that don't follow through on the studies that they promise to do. Although in those years since 2007, the FDA has never once done that, despite the fact that there is a lot of evidence that companies don't follow up on those post-approval studies as in as timely a fashion as they should. And we'll talk a bit more about that in the context of accelerated approval. This is the sort of general basic standard, but the FDA has recognized that we sometimes do need more flexible standards because there are different exigencies of different diseases. And so, in general, meeting the standard of substantial evidence that occurs from two adequate and well-controlled studies, the FDA generally says that 2 adequate and well-controlled studies would really provide substantial evidence, because any single trial may be subject to unanticipated, undetected systematic biases. But seeking 2 studies for evidence, for substantial evidence, can be a problem because it increases the cost of drug development and can lead to a delay in drugs being approved. And so there have been criticisms about whether or not that drags innovation. And it's been recognized that there are some diseases for which especially serious diseases like certain kinds of cancer or unmet medical need, where maybe patients would accept more risk, and maybe a single trial might be more might be just as reasonable in those circumstances, because there's there isn't enough treatments out there, and patients are facing real serious morbidity or mortality. So in response to that, over the last couple decades, the FDA and Congress have developed a number of different expedited pathways that allow drugs to get on the market without meeting the same standard level of evidence that might be expected to meet the statutory requirements. And a fast track, for example, which allows approval based on a single phase 2 trial for a serious or life-threatening disease, and accelerated approval, which we're going to talk more about, were both developed in the wake of the HIV epidemic in the 1980s, and the perception that the FDA did not have the resources to move fast enough for HIV medications. And so accelerated approval allows approval based on a surrogate measure that is only reasonably likely to predict benefit for serious or life-threatening diseases. And again, we'll focus a bit more on that one, but just to put it in context, there's also the priority review process, which mandates FDA review within 6 months for a therapeutic advance. The normal FDA review schedule happens along 10 months. And then the breakthrough therapy designation is the most recent one. And this is for drugs that treat serious or life-threatening diseases with preliminary clinical evidence of substantial improvement over existing therapies, although that preliminary evidence can be seen in a biomarker or some predictive toxicology studies. These are all the drugs approved in 2017 and the various pathways, accelerated pathways that they qualify for. And what you can see is that over the last couple of decades, these accelerated pathways have actually become the rule and not the exception. And now over 2/3, and in some years as many as 3/4 or more of new drugs are approved and qualify for one or more, some qualify for all of these expedited approval pathways that the FDA permits. And in addition to the various expedited pathways, the FDA has also been sort of subjecting its drug approvals to changing standards with respect to the amount of the types of evidence that they expect. And some have indicated that this is a loosening of the efficacy standard. So for example, the statute was changed in 1997 to require the FDA to approve a drug based on one adequate and well-controlled study if the circumstances are appropriate. And then studies that have looked at the pivotal trials leading to drug approval from 2 decades ago to now show that the number of new drugs approved on the basis of 2 pivotal trials has fallen. The number of drugs approved based on a drug that is, that is tested in a treatment against an active comparator as opposed to a placebo or historical control has fallen. So there are more single-arm studies being used to approve drugs. or placebo-controlled studies rather than studies against active comparators. The proportion of approvals based on non-randomized study has increased. And in general, there's been greater reliance on surrogate measures of response. And surrogate measures are, which we'll talk a little bit more about those, but those maybe used to be more like a third or less than half of studies, and now they're about 60% of new drugs are approved based on surrogate measures. And some of this change is as a result of the nature of drug approvals and the different drugs being approved now than there were 2 decades ago. But this is there's been studies that have done that suggest that that's not the full explanation for these trends. So with that as a background, just to focus in on accelerated approval, accelerated approval was FDA initiated in 1992 in the wake of the HIV crisis, and then formally approved in a congressional statute just a few years ago. But it's been implemented since 1992, and in general has involved about 10% of new drug approvals, although the number has been increasing in recent years. A surrogate measure is a laboratory test or a radiologic test or some other biomarker, and it's and a surrogate measure is the sort of your cholesterol level or a CEA antigen or something else that you might measure in the blood, or the sort of tumor size on a chest X-ray. This is to be contrasted with clinical endpoints, which a clinical endpoint is how a patient feels, functions, or survives. And some surrogate measures are validly linked with those clinical endpoints. In the accelerated approval was novel because it allowed a drug to be approved based on a surrogate measure that was only reasonably likely to predict an actual clinical endpoint. A surrogate, an accelerated approval drug is required, as opposed to just being strongly suggested, to conduct a post-approval confirmatory study. And technically, the FDA has the authority to withdraw an approved indication if that confirmatory study isn't done. And in addition to that, an accelerated approval drug has to contain a line in the labeling that says, this indication is approved under accelerated approval. Continued approval for this indication may be contingent on verification of clinical benefit, or an approval on survival has not been established. Again, the difference here is that we don't know if the drug actually affects clinical endpoints, but there's a reasonable likelihood that it might, and that this is intended to try to get that information across in the labeling. There are, of course, many important advantages of using surrogate measures in testing new drugs. Surrogate measures can predict efficacy or identify drug safety problems earlier, and so can allow clinical trials to be shorter or involve fewer patients, and therefore reduce the cost and time that those clinical trials take. Ideally, a surrogate measure would be validated with an actual clinical endpoint, which means that the marker is correlated with the endpoint and captures the net effect of the intervention on the clinical endpoint. Proving validation of a surrogate marker typically requires a number of different trials and meta-analysis of them to try to show these two factors. And there are a number of surrogate measures that have been validated as being good predictors, such as blood pressure as a surrogate measure of heart disease, or your LDL cholesterol level and as a surrogate measure for treatment with a statin to lower heart disease, viral load and HIV, disease-free survival, and overall survival in certain kinds of breast cancer or colon cancer. All of these are, and then once this is established, then you can say that showing changes in the surrogate measure can be predicted to lead to real clinical benefit, and that can, as I said, lead to some of the benefits of using the surrogate measure. At the same time, it's also important to recognize that there are problems using surrogate measures in clinical trials. One of those problems is that sometimes a surrogate measure you might think that it actually predicts efficacy, but then it actually doesn't in real life once you actually test the drug. And this is a study done by other folks out of UC San Francisco right now, where they looked at all approved cancer drugs and found that 2/3 of them in this time period were approved based on surrogate measures. And then they took this gray bar here on the left and they followed out, for 5 years what follow-up was on these cancer drugs. And what they found was that about half of the drugs approved based on the surrogate measure were not demonstrated to have any benefit in overall survival, and only about 15% were actually demonstrated to actually improve overall survival. And obviously the reason you take a cancer drug is to live longer, or to improve your symptoms, although most cancer drugs aren't taken just to improve symptoms. And a third of them, by the way, still had no known overall survival benefit because the follow-up studies hadn't been completed yet. So surrogate measures may fail, because they're not on the causal pathway of the disease process, or because the intervention being tested affects one of different causal pathways. Another problem with surrogate measures is that they may not reflect the true safety of a drug, and the medical history is riddled with cases of uses of drugs where the medical establishment has recommended drugs be used based on surrogate measures that then, once tested in a more rigorous, longer clinical trial, show that not only does the drug not work, but it actually is worse than the comparator. So, flecainide, for example, here on the left-hand side of the bottom, was approved based on its ability to reduce the amount of ventricular ectopic beats in patients who had a myocardial infarction. But then when it was actually studied in a comparative trial, it turned out that those patients who got flecainide had greater levels of mortality. And so what was then in wide use, using this antiarrhythmic in post-MI patients, then quickly fell out of favor. And then another problem with surrogate measures is the fact that the drugs that are approved based on changing surrogate measures that we don't know whether or not they have actual effects on clinical endpoints can be quite costly. And the reason for that is that in the US, drug prices are set by manufacturers at whatever level they want. And brand name drugs are much more costly in the United States than they are in other comparable countries. This is on the left, you can see OECD data from the US in terms of spending on pharmaceuticals versus other OECD countries. And on the right, you can see Medicare Part B drugs, which include some of the anti-cancer drugs. Most expensive anti-cancer drugs, many anti-cancer drugs are approved based on surrogate measures, and we're paying a lot more for them in the United States than in other countries. And this is a list of drugs approved based on surrogate measures, various surrogate measures from 2011 to 2016. And you can see there on the right, the cost in per month of treatments with these products. Again, we don't know if these products actually lead to improved survival in many of these cases in cancer, and yet we're paying substantial sums of money for them. $56,000 a month, $57,000 a month for this drug, which is a muscular dystrophy drug. This is a study we've done looking at Medicare spending specifically on accelerated approval drugs, and what we found from 2015 to 2019, there were 67 drugs paid for in Medicaid that had at least one accelerated approval indication, and that spending on accelerated approval drugs in Medicare had increased from $3 billion to $9 billion, most concentrated in Medicare Part B. Again, we estimated that about 3% of $100 billion, $127 billion in total Part D spending, which is the amount that we spend on retail drugs, and about 15% of spending in Part B related to accelerated approval drugs. And so again, not the majority of spending, but a good amount, and an amount that's been growing in recent years. So it begs the question of, how well is accelerated approval working? And by some measures, accelerated approval is working well. This was a study that the FDA had done, looking at all the cancer drug accelerated approvals that were approved over the previous 25 years, 64 cancer drugs for 93 indications. Of these 93 accelerated approvals, about half had fulfilled their post-marketing requirement, verified a benefit according to the FDA, and been converted to regular approval, a median of about 3.5 years after their initial accelerated approval. I would point out that in a study that we did that focused just on cancer drugs approved via accelerated approval from 2009 to 2013, we found that about half of them had not had their post-market study completed by 5 years of follow-up, which suggests that maybe this median is overly driven by a lot of the earlier drugs where the time to confirmation was much shorter. But the FDA pointed out that during this time, only 5 indications receiving accelerated approval, or about 5% of the sample, had been withdrawn from the market. And only one of those was withdrawn over the objection of the manufacturer. And this suggests that maybe accelerated approval is working well. I mean, how much, and this is an ethical question more than anything else, how much risk would we be willing to put up with to determine that this pathway has been working or not? Is 5%, a 5% failure rate good, or is it too much, too little? What should we be aiming for? So I think this is an important number to think about. However, it doesn't tell the whole story, because when we took a deeper look at the FDA's data, what we found is that when the FDA claimed that drugs had their benefit being confirmed, only a small number of those, only 15 or about 16%, were being confirmed based on a clinical endpoint. That a lot of these confirmatory studies were still being conducted on surrogate outcomes. Some of those surrogate outcomes were the same as the pre-approval trial. And so, it leads you to wonder, like, well, if the FDA, why is the FDA accepting, again, now that these are drugs that are on the market and available, why is the FDA accepting, continuing to accept surrogate outcomes? And some of these, in some of these cases, these surrogate outcomes might be validated surrogate outcomes. But if the surrogate outcome is the same as the pre-approval trial surrogate outcome, it's not likely that it's a very well validated surrogate outcome. And yet, nonetheless, these drugs are being converted to regular approval. Another thing that we noticed and wrote a bit about in the last couple of years, or what are sometimes called zombie, or what are sometimes called dangling accelerated approvals, but I'm calling zombie accelerated approval, which is an accelerated approval for which the post-approval study fails, but then nothing happens. The indication isn't converted to regular approval. The drug isn't withdrawn from the market. It's just out there. And so this was an earlier study that we did, pointing out 4 examples of this, where there was an accelerated approval on the basis of a response rate, and then the overall survival in the confirmatory trial was negative. The overall survival was negative. The progression-free survival was not improved, and these drugs hadn't yet been taken off the market or anything done about their accelerated approval indications. And overall, we identified 18 indications that failed to improve the primary endpoint, and not all of them had been voluntarily withdrawn yet. They just remained on the label. And in fact, the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, which is a professional society, had still been providing a high-level endorsement for all of the 6 that remained on the label. I would point out that since we've been publishing this, now the FDA has been taking some steps to talk with companies to try to remove these indications from the label of their products. In many cases, this is not removing the drug from the market. It's just removing one indication from the numerous indications of the drug. But the FDA has said, look, if there are clear reasons why a trial may not have achieved its primary endpoint and an unmet medical need still exists, the FDA will work with sponsors to identify subsequent clinical trials that could satisfy the accelerated approval requirement. So in this case, if you fail on your first confirmatory trial, sometimes the FDA will give you a second bite of the apple to try to conduct another trial that is positive. And again, this is a good some flexibility on the FDA's part, but I think is also worthwhile thinking about when we think about the functioning of the accelerated approval pathway. So then, just to provide a few case examples, this I think is a good example of how accelerated approval is supposed to work. And Imatinib, or Gleevec, which was originally approved for CML. In 2001, there were 3 phase 2 studies done in different presentations of CML, chronic phase, active phase, that enrolled a total of about 1,000 patients, resistant, so they had no other real good treatment options, and it showed cytogenetic responses and hematologic responses far beyond what might be expected, from any other kind of rescue therapy that might be tried, and it sort of what seemed like a good duration of response. And so after 2.5 months of FDA review, the FDA granted accelerated approval in 2001. A confirmatory trial was done that showed improvements in progression-free survival. And on this basis, again, 90% of patients who achieve major response maintain that response after 2 years. I mean, these are really remarkable outcomes. And in this case, converting based on progression-free survival seems like a reasonable decision. And by the way, it only occurred, these trials were reported 2.5 years later, and the drug was converted to regular approval in 2003. So this to me seems like a successful implementation of accelerated approval. Here's another successful implementation of accelerated approval, bevacizumab for metastatic breast cancer, which was originally approved in 2008 on the basis of a 5.5-month increase in progression-free survival when added to paclitaxel therapy for patients with metastatic breast cancer. Again, perhaps reasonable to approve this drug for accelerated approval because, again, this is a patient group that didn't have a lot of choices at this point for their disease. A confirmatory trial that was completed about 2 years later showed actually a much smaller increase in median progression-free survival in a more controlled setting, as well as no increase in overall survival. And the oncology advisory committee voted 12-1 to remove this indication. The company argued strongly against removing this indication, that removing indications over the company's disagreement has no precedent, that there's the possible benefit in subgroups of patients. Individuals' patients' choice ought to be paramount in this situation, and that this will, of course, as the industry responds in almost every circumstance when policies are going against it, this will, of course, block all innovation for the future. But the FDA nonetheless went through the process and removed the indication from the labeling in November 2011. So here's an example where drug was approved on some promise and accelerated approval based on an early stage study. A later stage study that was more well controlled showed that promise was not as expected and didn't really have an effect on overall survival, and the indication was removed from the drug. This is, by contrast, an example of how accelerated approval is not supposed to work. This is Eteplirsen, which is a drug for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, an exon skipping drug that allowed, muscular dystrophy is devastating because the patients have a lack of a functional dystrophin protein in their muscle. And this exon skipping drug was designed to try to allow a recovery of a shortened but still functional dystrophin protein. But after 3 to 3.5 years of therapy, there was only about a 1% increase in dystrophin observed in the muscle fibers, as compared to what we might expect, in a Becker-like system. I think the minimum expected level is about 10% of dystrophin in the muscle. So this is well beyond what we might expect any legitimate meaningful clinical effect to have. The advisory committee that I was a member of found that we did not meet the substantial evidence standard. The FDA also did not recommend its approval, but it was overruled by Office of New Drugs Director Janet Woodcock at the time in 2016, with sort of an internal report suggesting that part of the concern here was that there would be inability for the drug to continue to be tested, and that patients would lapse into a position of self-treatment and abandon all hope of approval. And so the FDA ended up approving the drug over the objections of the advisory committee. And the company, by the way, set a price at about $300,000 a year and a 5-year time window for a follow-up trial. By the way, in January of 2020, the FDA issued a notice of concern, now 4 years later, that you still have not initiated your required confirmatory study for this drug. So this, again, seems like not the way accelerated approval is supposed to function. Okay, so then turning to the last bit to talk more specifically about Aducanumab, and whether or not, what features of this story relating to accelerated approval Aducanumab is you see in some of the characteristics of the Aducanumab approval. Aducanumab has been called the worst drug approval decision in recent FDA history. I called it that. It's sort of I guess, kind of a Trumpian way of referring to that. But, so there are people out there that are referring to it as the worst drug approval decision in recent FDA history. And so, I think that there are some real concerns about the process used to approve this drug and the evidence behind the drug as well. There's good, so aducanumab is a drug that targets amyloid plaques, which is a feature of Alzheimer's disease. And in an early phase 1b study, basically there's a lot of excitement about this drug because it showed substantial reduction in amyloid plaque. But again, it wasn't there. It's not clear, and the FDA, even in the words of the FDA, the amyloid was not known as a treatment surrogate measure for clinical improvement, even though amyloid does, is a feature of Alzheimer's disease. It's not clear that clearing amyloid necessarily affects the course of Alzheimer's disease. That is a controversial point that was not. There was no agreement in the field about that, and as a result, Biogen, to its credit, developed two nearly identical, large prospective randomized trials intended to test the actual clinical benefits of this drug in patients with mild cognitive impairment and mild Alzheimer's disease. And those trials were designed with a plan to analyze them together about halfway through. And when that analysis happened, the Data Safety Monitoring Board identified that there was no prospect that this drug would work, that this drug was so-called futile, treatment with the drug was futile, and recommended to Biogen that it stop the clinical trials. And that's what Biogen did. And then after it stopped the clinical trials, a little bit more data came in, and Biogen went back and reanalyzed these two trials separately and found that in one of the two trials, in the high dose arm, there was a statistically significant effect of the aducanumab group. In the other trial, in the high dose arm, there was no effect. And in fact, the placebo group actually did slightly better than the aducanumab group. But in that one trial, there was a clinical effect. An absolute difference in the clinical outcome, this rating of various dementia symptoms called the CDR, clinical dementia rating sum of boxes, a change of about 0.39. So the CDR-SB is a 0 to 18 point scale. After 18 months of therapy, the high dose aducanumab group had worsened also, just like the placebo group, but it had worsened 0.39 less than the high dose group on average. And this there was some question about whether or not this was a meaningful clinical effect, because the minimum meaningful clinical effect that's been widely suggested for the CDR sum of boxes is a change of about 1 to 2 points out of 18 points, not 0.39 being less than that. And so it's possible that that's not really a noticeable effect on average. In addition to that, there were important safety concerns with the drug, in that about a third of patients in the high dose group experienced small microbleeds or swelling in the brain, as opposed to 3% of patients in the placebo group. Most of those cases were mild, but patients did get multiple MRIs during the course of the clinical trial, and were closely monitored, and were found that if they adjusted the dose, that they could deal with those safety issues could be dealt with. And so they brought this case before the advisory committee in November 2020 and made the explicit statement that they weren't using amyloid as a surrogate for efficacy. They wanted to know what we thought about its effect on the clinical endpoints and the clinical course of Alzheimer's disease. And we voted nearly unanimously, 11 votes with 1 abstention, I think, or 10 votes with 1 abstention, that there was no substantial evidence, no convincing evidence that this drug had any real clinical effects on Alzheimer's disease. In June 2021, then many of us were surprised when the FDA nonetheless granted approval of the product, but they didn't grant approval based on the effects on its clinical function. They granted approval based on accelerated approval. They said that we're going to grant approval because this drug does very well at clearing amyloid, and we think that clearing amyloid is a a biomarker surrogate measure that is reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. I would note that it was originally approved for the treatment of all Alzheimer's disease without any clarification, but then later revised so that it was intended to be started in patients who had mild Alzheimer's disease. And the manufacturer was granted 9 years to complete its post-approval confirmatory trial. So again, I just want to emphasize that this is a problematic process to not sort of at least publicly state that you weren't going to use accelerated approval as a basis for and biomarker, the surrogate measure of amyloid plaques as the basis for approval, and then subsequently approve the drug using accelerated approval as a basis without, again, mentioning the rationale for that. And, so I think that a lot of people were concerned that this is a problematic process. But I think that it leaves the question open, is it a problematic approval? Is it reasonable to conclude that amyloid plaque and the removal of amyloid plaque is reasonably likely to predict clinical benefits? That is, where the controversy currently is right now. And, unlike many accelerated approval drugs where we don't have clinical evidence at the same time that we have evidence of the approval on the surrogate measure, here we actually do have actual clinical evidence, of that again was reviewed by the FDA and not determined to be good enough to approve the drug on the basis of. So I think it's also reasonable to question whether or not amyloid is a reasonable surrogate measure. And evidence in that suggests that it might not be a reasonable surrogate measure is that there have been dozens of therapies that have targeted amyloid before. Some have been more successful, some have been less successful at clearing it, but none of them have shown to affect meaningful clinical benefit in patients. And one of the possibilities is that amyloid is not on the causative pathway between the disease and the actual clinical outcome. So that's one theory. Now, in fairness, an alternative explanation is that none of those previous drugs was as good as Aducanumab is. That Aducanumab is just a new horizon of Alzheimer's disease therapies. And, maybe the past studies failed because they included too many participants without brain amyloid or used too low of doses, or they recruited patients in too late stage of disease. And supporters of the drug have pointed to the fact that there's another drug that's in clinical trials called Donanemab, that has published an early study using a different cognitive function endpoint that showed a statistically significant, increase or sort of a reduction in worsening over time, over 18 months of therapy. They lost 6 points or 7 points with donanemab versus 10 points with placebo. Again, I would point out that this is a 144-point scale. So this is 6 or 10 points out of 144 points. And I would also point out that donanemab had no significant differences in the CDR sum of boxes rating, which was a secondary outcome in this trial. So I guess an open question is accelerated approval appropriate for aducanumab? Is it reasonably likely that a change in the observable amyloid plaques caused by high-dose aducanumab will improve the course of patients with Alzheimer's disease? A recent meta-analysis of amyloid-lowering drugs suggested that amyloid reduction is unlikely to substantially alter the disease course. Before aducanumab's approval, the FDA itself said it didn't consider this to be an acceptable surrogate. And an acceptable surrogate should correlate with a clinical endpoint, but FDA reviews of the 2 trials for aducanumab found no evidence of changes correlating amyloid changes with the cognitive or functional changes in patients with Alzheimer's disease. And so actually the FDA said it's not clear that there's any linkage between reduction in plaque and clinical change. So in general, in my view, it's hard to reconcile the lack of convincing clinical benefit across 2 prospective trials with the FDA's conclusion that accelerated approval was appropriate because there's some clinical benefit of unknown magnitude over some unknown time frame. And then, of course, it's also hard to understand why they were given 9 years for their follow-up study. And based on our previous research, well, what happens then? Like, what if the trial is negative? Will they get another bite at the apple? Will there be steps taken to try to remove the indication from the labeling or the drug from the market at that time? Meanwhile, there's been relatively poor communication relating to the drug. For example, this was Aduhelm was approved by the FDA, making it the first disease-modifying therapy for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. Again, no, it isn't. It just reduces your amyloid plaque, and we don't know if it actually affects the disease. That's why another trial, I think, would be the right thing to do in trying to understand this drug. And then, by the way, the drug was made available at a price of $56,000 per year, which, some estimates have said that even if a small percentage of early Alzheimer's disease patients end up using it, it could cost, just this one drug could cost more than the entire Medicare Part B program spends on all its drugs. And one estimate suggested more than even the budget of NASA would be spent on just this one drug. And so right now there's a lot of debates over whether or not private payers should provide coverage for this product. And usually the public payers don't have that choice, although the CMS is undertaking the relatively uncommon process of a national coverage determination to try to determine the basis for its covering, for Medicare covering this drug. And that the results of that process should be completed by April of 2022. So what are some ways to try to improve accelerated approval? I think that confirmatory trials should be more likely to use, more confirmatory trials should use clinical endpoints. There should be really, a clinical endpoint should be the default for a confirmatory trial. Again, at this point, the drug is on the market. And again, I think if there are reasons not to use a clinical endpoint because there's a really good, surrogate that's well validated, then, those things can be discussed. But the default, I think, for confirmatory trials for accelerated approval drugs should be clinical endpoints. The protocol for the confirmatory trial should be finalized and agreed upon as a condition of accelerated approval so that trial enrollment can begin at the same time as approval, or ideally before final approval. So this sort of like changing to accelerated approval just before approving from regular approval is really not the right process to use. This should be something that everybody agrees on from the get-go. Withdrawal of accelerated approval should be automatically triggered if the confirmatory trial is negative. And if additional studies need to be done, then those studies can be done at that point, but the indication shouldn't remain on the label. And then finally, we should consider whether the price of accelerated approval drugs should be curtailed, because it doesn't seem reasonable to pay the same amount of money for drugs that have really good, well-validated clinical endpoints, and drugs that are approved based on accelerated approval and surrogate endpoints that are only reasonably likely to predict a clinical endpoint. And so, there are various ways to consider doing that, including, capping the price of a drug, excluding them from standard drug coverage mandates that cover Medicare and Medicaid, adding an additional inflationary rebate penalty for every year that the confirmatory trial isn't completed outside of a specified time period. And this was an economic analysis we did of one of these proposals that's going to be coming out, where we found that might lead to some substantial Medicaid savings of anywhere from $500 million to $5 billion over a 5-year period, based on drugs, accelerated approval drugs from available in the last 5 years to Medicaid. So those are my comments, and I'm really interested to hear what people have to say.
Aaron, thank you. That was a superb talk, and I think if it wasn't evident before to this audience, very nice audience we're getting on a Thursday afternoon, by the way, you're a leading national voice on this topic, and also we're right in the middle of this controversy. We have a number of questions that folks have posed. Let me start with one or two of my own, and then we're going to go to the questions from the participants. So you had a slide that showed very nicely some suggestions for how accelerated approval could take advantage of confirmatory trials much more effectively, and perhaps require them more. Could you just hum a few more bars about this moment of approval whereby either accelerated or traditional or other, whereby at that point the cat's kind of out of the bag, and the subsequent enforcement seems to be very lax. And of course, everyone knows this. And do you think that there is hope for a strong emphasis on that post-market phase and the confirmatory approvals under these pathways, or is that more of a something that the incumbents at the time, several years later, will tend to be more focused on the new drugs coming through because of staffing and other things? Is there a pathway to strengthening that arm of the approval process?
Yeah, so I think that's really, I think that's a really important insight that you're bringing up there, which is that, the FDA's authority to, get things done, to require that studies are done, or to, to ensure that studies are done, is really powerful in the pre-approval period when they have that carrot in the future of a drug's approval. And that authority falls substantially after the drug's approved. And again, technically, as I said, the FDA has the ability to, so accelerated approval is different from the rest of approvals, because under the rest of approvals, the FDA really can't pull a drug off the market if the confirmatory trial is not done. It'd be one thing if the confirmatory trial was done and it showed an important safety problem, then maybe the FDA has a hook for pulling a drug off the market. But with accelerated approval, unlike the rest of drug approvals, the FDA actually can technically pull a drug or an indication of a drug off the market or an indication off labeling if the accelerated approval study isn't done. And so under accelerated approval, there is a bit more authority that the FDA has. But even still, the FDA does not have the same amount of authority. And it's really challenging from an administrative point of view to implement that kind of power. And that's why usually the FDA tries to negotiate with the pharmaceutical company to voluntarily withdraw in those cases, which is, a fraught pathway on its own, rather than going through the process. Rather than going through the process that it went through with bevacizumab for metastatic breast cancer, because that process took, a year of multiple hearings and, a lot of publicity and protests from patients with metastatic breast cancer and really challenging testimony. And I think that you get the FDA is loath to go through that same kind of process. And so as a result, they have to default to like informal ways of trying to pressure companies to do X or Y. So, I mean, I think that, as a pathway forward, I think that it would be, so first of all, it would be the easiest pathway forward would be to give the FDA more power, legislatively or through some other pathway to, or to give the FDA more resources to devote to this kind of post-approval enforcement or oversight of accelerated approval of drugs. Another way to try to do it would be to, be more clear up front that like, here's the study that that we expect you to do. And then also to be transparent about the progress through that process. And then, try to leave it to, market pressures or other informal pressures to try to make sure that the companies follow through on their trials in a timely fashion. But you are right that it is in the current situation, the FDA's real and, real authority and, sort of practical authority does fall off in the post-approval period, which makes implementing these kinds of things much harder.
One more question from me, and then go to some other excellent questions. What do you think is going to be the next stage in this particular approval controversy? One area of influence that's very important in how many patients end up seeing this drug is who will pay for it. And how do you see that playing out? CMS, Veterans Affairs, large
so
payers?
the Veterans Affairs has already said that they're not going to cover it except in, I think, in sort of extreme circumstances. But and I think that what we'll see over the next few months, we'll see more individual institutions making and private payers making decisions about this drug. groups like the Cleveland Clinic and Mount Sinai in New York have already come out and said that they're not going to put the drug in their formulary. And I think we'll see other groups, that other institutions that'll come out and say that as well. Some will come out and say that they are going to administer the drug. So I think there'll be like a patchwork of access, which is going to just increase the, sort of issues related to equity and around this product. And then ultimately this will all reach ahead with the national coverage determination in the spring of 2022 that Medicare is going to put out, because with Alzheimer's disease, Medicare is the sort of 800-pound gorilla in the room of payers. And so we'll see what Medicare does with its coverage determination. This process has been a process for me full of unprecedented moves. So I wouldn't put anything past Medicare necessarily, but it would be unprecedented for Medicare to say that it will not cover this drug. It is more likely that Medicare will say that they will cover it under certain, limited circumstances. They need a positive PET scan, or they'll need they'll limit it to patients with certain diagnostic criteria for early Alzheimer's disease or something. They might do that, but Medicare does not have a track record of not covering FDA approved drugs. It's just usually not done. So I'd be surprised. But hey, as I said, a lot of things about this process have surprised me.
If they require imaging, that will drive a lot of imaging studies as well. So I'm sure there's advocacy for that as well.
Yeah.
So here's a question from Steve Greenberg. Doesn't this Aducanumab trial itself provide the strongest scientific evidence to date that beta amyloid reduction is not an adequate surrogate biomarker where there was no clinical benefit coupled with substantial beta amyloid reduction?
Yes, I think that's, again, I think that's part of some of the paradoxical issues relating to the approval of this drug through accelerated approval. It's again, accelerated approval usually occurs in the context of a change in a surrogate measure, but we don't yet know what the clinical data are showing. Those are coming. In this case, we actually have clinical data at the same time. And so to say that we reasonably expect those sort of large changes in amyloid to translate to clinical outcomes, and then to have at the same time trials showing that it doesn't actually translate to clinical outcomes, to me is just sort of it's hard to bridge those two sentences, those two kind of those two sentiments. So yeah, I would agree with that like this actually is a good evidence that this is not actually a good surrogate measure. And so just sort of more questions as to why it was that they defaulted to this pathway. And it would have been great. Again, I think it would have been great to have more of a public discussion about why this pathway was being considered, how it is that you can sort of hold those two thoughts at the same time. But that, and the FDA, to its credit, has released some additional information, more than usual, around an approval, but hasn't, I think, answered some of these fundamental questions.
Here's a provocative question from the always provocative Don Goldman. Do you believe the process was sufficiently insulated from pharma company influence?
So no, I think that the level of coordination between the FDA and Biogen was, unprecedented to my knowledge, at least. I mean, it might be that there are these kinds of close relationships. So when a drug company then there's a drug in clinical development, usually the drug company does meet frequently with the FDA, and that happens before the IND is filed, at the end of phase 1, at the end of phase 2, any other times in the middle when the company requests a meeting. So there is frequent communication between companies and the FDA around investigational drugs. But I think even with that understanding, the level of coordination between Biogen and the FDA in this case was very high. I think that it began with this sort of process after Biogen pulled the two trials apart after the DSMB review and found the statistically significant result in one of the trials. The FDA and Biogen then worked together to try to figure out why that trial was the right one and the other trial was the wrong one. And that began a process of months long process of back and forth between them. And again, I'm not aware that kind of level of close working relationship is common. So I do think that it is outside the norm of the norm of reasonable, appropriate, and necessary levels of communication between companies and the FDA. And then I think that kind of reached ahead at the advisory committee meeting, when usually advisory committees, at least that I've been a part of, the company says, presents its product, and the FDA presents its questions, and usually you can see where there's some controversy. And in this case, there was really no daylight between the company's points of view and the FDA's view at the advisory committee, which I guess was also a very strange, abnormal, at least to me, not the norm for advisory committee meetings dynamic.
Question from Gorgana Savova, sensitive question from the patient perspective. The general public has been exposed to the media effects of the AD drug approval. I would guess that many Alzheimer's disease patients were super excited. How would you approach an Alzheimer's disease patient and explain in a convincing way the situation surrounding the drug? How should we deal with the media effects of poorly presented drug trial facts?
Yeah, and that, I think, is a big challenge, and I think it's a real pity as to how this has unfolded. It's been presented as here is a drug that will provide Alzheimer's disease patients with hope, and I think that unfortunately the evidence just isn't there, and I think that Alzheimer's disease patients want hope, but they want realistic hope, like hope, a meaningful innovation, and this drug just doesn't have that. And I think that I just have primary care patients who have Alzheimer's disease or who are elderly and risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. And if they ask me about this, I would tell them that I don't recommend it, that there isn't good evidence that it works. There are these conflicting trials. One says it might work a little, one says it doesn't work. And at the same time, there's a lot of important safety issues that arise with the drug that are challenging to stay on top of, and could be quite devastating. And I wouldn't recommend it. So I wouldn't prescribe the drug. But I do understand the really tough position that patients are in, and the sort of I feel like it's almost worse to kind of get people's hopes up like this, and then to not be able to deliver on it. And I think that's really a tragedy. And so I think that kind of I think the sort of sentiment behind that question is what hopefully people are thinking about when they're thinking about how to communicate about this product in the news or in other forums, because I think that getting patients' hopes up like that is really unfair.
Agreed. Last question from Tim Miller. Should the US have an agency like some EU countries do that explicitly considers the economics of approved drug before CMS decides to reimburse?
Yes, very, very clearly, yes. So just for everybody else, in other industrialized countries, putting a drug on the market is usually a two-step process. The first step is the regulatory approval, and then there's a second health technology assessment step in which a group of independent experts look at the drug's data and compare its benefits to what's already available on the market, and try to determine if it's an improvement over what's on the market for the treatment of the disease or not. And that assessment is then used as part of the process for negotiating a price of the drug and the drug's availability. And in the US, we only have that first step. We only have the FDA approval step, and then the drug's approved. And for some public payers, they don't have a choice. They have to cover drugs, especially cancer drugs. And private payers, in general, tend to follow what the public payers do in some circumstances. Although, more recently, some private payers have been developing more closed formularies that have been excluding some products. So, but what we don't have in the US is we don't have any kind of national, formal assessment of drugs. And I think that kind of a thing in this case would have been very helpful, because there's an organization based out of Boston called the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, which is an independent organization that analyzed aducanumab. And they said, now you can't really do a cost effectiveness analysis for a drug that doesn't have effectiveness. But what they did is they assumed that the non-statistically significant slight benefit from the blended trials was the benefit that you would expect from the drug, even though it wasn't a statistically significant change. And they concluded that a fair price for the drug based on that, would have been something in the range of $6,000 to $7,000 a year rather than $57,000 a year. And so, I think that kind of assessment, if done, across the board for new drugs, would help, provide some, negotiating pushback for payers when they're considering, how much new drugs are actually worth. So yes, that's a long way of saying I completely agree that second step of the process is necessary in the U.S.
That's great. So let's begin to wrap up. There's a comment, not a question, from Konstantin suing us, and he says, just wanted to say how fantastic of a talk this was and appreciate you sharing your thoughts and perspective with us. And Aaron Kesselheim, I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for spending time with us today and educating us and bringing us up to speed on the history of these drug approvals, as well as how we might think about these going forward. I'll just point out to folks on the Zoom, we have a number of very interesting upcoming talks in our Landmark Ideas series, another series out of CHIP that are listed here. And you can visit us, email us, and follow us. And again, thank you very much to Dr. Aaron Kesselheim.
My pleasure. Thank you.